Uh, she says, "You see, I told you, I'm a leader. I was trying to lead. That was my mistake." So we arrive now at the heart of the show, and this is where we're going to present a couple talks for you. Just a few words about how this works. It's a very sort of a grassrootsy thing, what we're trying to do here. We work with people in the town and help them develop their voices and their stories to share. And part of this is the belief that we can do it ourselves, and we don't need necessarily to import our culture from afar. We already focus on the eating locally thing and the shopping locally. We just want to produce our culture locally too, because culture in a way is just sort of a way of thinking and processing in kind of a high bandwidth way about the stuff that matters to us as a community. That's really all culture is. And that's what we try to do here. So, by the same token, the people who you're going to see tonight, they are locals. They're not professionals. They've never been on a stage before. This is totally new to them, and it's taken a lot of guts for them to do this. So I guess I just ask you to bear that in mind, give them your support and your applause, appreciation, and your ears. And with that, I'll introduce our first talker tonight. He is a father, a husband, a citizen, an elected official. He teaches science down in Springfield. He is a PhD. Please join me in welcoming Trevor Baptiste.
Thank you, Oliver. Thank you.
Welcome, Dad.
Hey, folks. Good evening, everybody. Good evening. It is an honor and a privilege to be here to address you all tonight. And before I ever address folks in public and publicly and share myself, I always like to put things in context and give reverence and honor to the ancestors that have come before all of us. Ancestors that we don't know the names of. I say Ashe too, Ashe. And then, of course, before I speak about my stories, I talk about the ancestors that I came from. Irene Babs, Helen Bright, Esther Dufaulk, Eugene Baptiste, William Bell. William Bell was my grandfather. My earliest memories of him was sitting on his lap as he drove a canary yellow Cadillac through the neighborhood. I could barely get my fingers around the wood grain steering wheel. I was 5 years old when my grandfather died. But even then, I knew my grandfather was a guardian of the community. See, I'm from Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, New York, the heart of Brooklyn. Some people don't know this. It used to be two different neighborhoods, Bedford and Stuyvesant. When black people moved in, they just shortened the name as Bed-Stuy. I remember as a youth, I'd walk through Bed-Stuy, and old guys would be sitting on their stoop, and they talk about my grandfather with reverence. They see me coming, "Hey, that's William Bell's grandson. How you doing, boy?" It wasn't until much later my father sat me down and told me the story. You see, your grandfather ran the numbers. Now, some of y'all might not know what that means, but if you were fortunate enough to put your money on the right number, it was my grandfather that paid you. My father said, just in case, he used to carry a little 38 on his hip. I know what y'all thinking. That sounds a little seedy. But my grandfather cared about his community. You see, back in the 40s and the 50s, if you were a black man and you wanted to start a business, you couldn't go to a bank and get a loan. That was just part of the economic oppression of the time. But you could go to my grandfather, and if you were from the community and he knew you, he'd front you the money for a business. My mother used to send me to the meat market on Sundays. She'd say to me, "Tell Mr. Randy to put it on our tab." You see, my grandfather fronted the money for Mr. Randy to start that business. In effect, my grandfather was the community's bank. In his own way, he was a gangster. But where I grew up in Bed-Stuy, those things are not a contradiction. So I've been thinking a lot lately about what it means to be a guardian of the community. My mother was a guardian of the community. She grew up right there in Bed-Stuy, the daughter of my grandfather. He amassed enough wealth, he made sure she went to college. She got masters and doctorates. She started out as a teacher in her neighborhood, then worked in the central office, and then became the principal of the junior high school she went to. I later on went to that junior high school, the Clara Cardwell School for the Gifted, Intermediate School 308. I miss that school, the blue and gold. I grew up watching my mother fight for her political life. She had political enemies on the school board, no less. They would say awful things about my mother. You think things are bad around here? I would be in the grocery store as a little boy with my mother, and school board members would find her in the street and curse out in front of me. Once her enemies even got her removed from her school. The whisper campaign was awful. They used to say, she's a voodoo priestess. The community rallied behind her, supported her. My mother got her school back. I remember she dusted it off. She said, they don't really believe I'm a voodoo priestess, or else they wouldn't be messing with me. That's my mama. And there were other guardians of the community. I can remember a Mr. Michael Hooper. He was an educator in our community. And along with other educators and my mother, they started a group with an idea. They thought, our inner city youth in Bed-Stuy need to understand the African diaspora. So during the year, we would study about the African diaspora and raise funds, and in the summertime, we take field trips all over the world. They called it Roots Revisited. One of our earliest trips was to Brazil. Yeah, I was 12 years old the first time I went to Brazil, Bahia, Brazil. We stayed in a beautiful 5-star hotel by the sea. It was wonderful. By day, we would tour different schools and meet local community leaders. Real cultural exchange with other descendants of Africa. There were many lessons to learn. The managers of the hotel, they were from Germany. Presumably, they left Germany to escape war crimes after World War II. They weren't shy at all about their discontent at us staying at this hotel. By night, when we'd return from fabulous days, we got terrible service, general disrespect. Some people even found their rooms ransacked and bags searched. They generally took any chance they could to disrespect us while we were staying. And ultimately, it culminated when we were about to leave. You see, one person in our group of 30, as we were checking out, owed $50 for a laundry bill. She was fresh out of cash. She agreed she'd stay behind and get some money sent from the States. So here was the scenario. It was us, the ambassadors from Bed-Stuy, doing these real cultural exchanges with the descendants of enslaved Africans there in Brazil, some of whom actually worked at the hotel. And here we were faced with a hotel manager that said, none of y'all can leave unless this person pays her bill. Next thing you know, 10 men with batons come out, surround our tour bus to ensure we can't get on it. Just because they thought they had the authority doesn't mean that they did. My mother had a beat-em-bow, and for those of you guys who haven't been to Brazil yet, a beat-em-bow is a traditional Brazilian instrument. It's a long stick, curved with a string on it like a bow, and a gourd at the end. It's sort of a cross between a guitar and a drum. Well, it was a sight to behold. My mother fending off these 10 security guards while her sons and her students and other community members from Bed-Stuy picked up our bags and plowed them over like they were so many bowling pins. Yeah, it was the ambassadors from Bed-Stuy versus the security apparatus of a hotel, represented by 10 men with sticks. You can guess who won that one. And incidentally, it was the last time we elected to stay in a 5-star hotel. From then on, we stayed with the people we culturally exchanged with. You see, my mother understood power. She had gone up against the school committee. My mother understood that 10 men with sticks weren't more powerful than the 30 men, women, and children from our community. Well, when you're 12 years old, like I was, this kind of thing leaves an impression on you. For me, the lesson wasn't the obvious things like fight Nazis or resist racism or even be courageous. All those are good lessons, but that's not what I took from it. You see, what I understood was most power is leveraged through intimidation. In other words, if you're not intimidated, power is forced to meet you face to face. My mother knew that they couldn't beat us. Well, when I was growing up in Bed-Stuy, I got challenged all the time. I mean, it was almost like a neighborhood pastime. Big kids see little kids, they beat them up. That ended for me shortly after this trip to Brazil. You see, at this point, my mother was working in the central office, and her office mate had a son that went to school with me, Lamont. Lamont was in the 3rd grade, and I was in the 8th grade, so after school, Lamont and I would walk to our parents' office together. He'd hold my hand. I was sort of like a big brother to him. One day, a bigger kid stops us in the street, put his hand right on my chest, put his other hand in my pocket. Hey, shorty, where you going? Where's your money at? What you got in your pockets? I remember holding Lamont's hand, and he looked over and up at me as if to say, damn, Trev, you just gonna let that happen? The shame that I felt. I had to do something. So I let Lamont's hand go. I got in a stance. I said, look, man, you can have what's in my pocket, but we're gonna have to fight first. I probably didn't say it that confidently, I promise you. My knees were trembling in anticipation about what was about to happen. I was relieved when the boy looked me in the face and said, hey, shorty, I just wanted to see what you was made of. Y'all go ahead about your way. Now Lamont was looking at me like, hey, Trev, you my hero. And my chest swole with pride because I didn't let myself be intimidated. You understand? You see, various kinds of intimidation are usually coping mechanisms for folks when they are anxious about the limits of their power. You can see that all the time growing up in the hood. People have to cope. We artfully play this out by playfully insulting each other. It's called a dozens. Do it on purpose. You can build your confidence up if you are good at playing the dozens. This gives you a kind of psychic armor when you go in situations where your power is not going to be strong. You know you'll be all right. Now, if your psychic armor was weak, or you were thin-skinned, or you just weren't good at playing the dozens, sometimes you might default to physical forms of intimidation. My mother used to artfully call these guys what-ups. I'm sure you guys have recognized them. They eye to eye looking at each other. What's up, man? What you gonna do now? What you gonna do? Well, what you gonna do? 90% of the time, it's always intimidation. Nobody would throw a punch, just talk. Now, don't get me wrong. There's always that 1 out of 10 times where intimidation don't work. And then guns and knives would come out. I see a lot of that where I was from, too. See, where I was from, you could get shot or stabbed, and you could be laying in the street for an hour, 2 hours before an ambulance would come, if an ambulance would come at all. This was a real problem in our neighborhood. But like I said, we had guardians of our community. I can remember a man, James Rocky Robinson. We called him Rock. He was an EMT, and he saw these problems firsthand. The city neglecting our community. So he took it upon himself to start a volunteer ambulance corps. The first black volunteer ambulance corps in the nation, the Bed-Stuy Volunteer Ambulance Corps, BizVac we called it. It was my best friend, Tim, that got me involved. We joined the youth squad. On the weekends, we would sit in BizVac headquarters, a trailer with 4 ambulances, everybody permitted and insured. We had all the accoutrements of authority, uniforms, badges, equipment. And my friend Tim and I would wait for a police call, a chance for somebody that needed us. Most of the time, it's not as gruesome as you see on TV. Plenty of gunshots and stabbings. If a call was less than 10 blocks away, we could run there faster than an ambulance could get there. And we loved to do it. You get on the scene, somebody would be stabbed, crying, hurt. You'd stabilize the person, look for exit wound, catch your breath, then the ambulance would show up. Report what happened, give each other high fives, and walk home heroes. For Tim and I and our peers, they called us the trauma troopers. And this is the way that we didn't end up being what-ups. We didn't have to intimidate. Because we were the guys that our peers knew if you got in trouble, we scraped you off the ground and got you to the hospital. We were the guys that our friends knew, don't shoot or hurt or intimidate those guys. If we need them, they'll be here. Like my grandfather before me, I was now somebody the community needed. My mother and I used to argue about it sometimes. I mean, she didn't want me hanging out all hours of the night, running through the streets. I'm her firstborn son. So, being a defiant teenager, sometimes I would climb out of the 3rd story of our brownstone. I guess you could kind of say this is how I got my start serving the community, climbing out of the 3rd story of my brownstone. I don't think it was always easy for my mother, being a guardian of the community and all. She would sit me down and tell me, son, everybody you're trying to help is not going to thank you for it. You help your community because that's what you want your community to be. That's who you are. So I asked her, what made you who you are, Mommy? And she said, my father, my grandfather, William Bell. She said, growing up with Daddy, community was an extension of family. Some parents would have to leave and go to work, and other parents would stay behind and watch the children. Yeah, it was understood that children were going to be respectful and children were going to act a certain way because they were always being watched. If not by their own parents, by somebody's parents. Now, I know this might seem like an old-fashioned idea. In modern times, this might even seem like an anomaly. But 9 years ago, I started a family of my own. And I'm a trained biologist, so I make no bones about it. When it boils down to it, it's all about advancing your genes. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? You see, I don't just want to prepare my children for the world. I want to prepare the world for my children. When that's your goal, seeing intimidation for the bullying it really is gets real easy. It gets real easy. Now, I want to bring this all together for you guys now. I want to bring this all together. I'm a teacher. I teach in Springfield, a community not unlike Bed-Stuy, full of the same kind of systemic oppression and marginalization that is common to the urban experience. And now I want to contrast that for you with elite academies, like the kind you find right around here, like the kind where deer run free through hidden open fields. You know? David Koch went to a school like that, a place where billionaires and captains of industry and sheikhs and kings send their children. In places like this, the interesting thing is power is presumed. It's a birthright. And realistically, most of us consider it that way too, as if power was some kind of privilege that comes from your class or your status or your money. But I want you all to consider this. You see, my grandfather, he didn't come from money. He had a middle school education. Yet he had this mindset to leverage his power, whatever he had. I mean, this is the kind of man that sent his children to college and bought a new Cadillac every 2 years. He knew how to leverage his power, and his power base was his community. Sometimes I wonder how my grandfather was able to develop such a powerful mindset. He didn't learn it from elite academies. He might not have learned it from school at all. Yet he definitely had it in common with folks who presume their own power. And what are our schools about anyway? I mean, are our schools about raising positive and productive citizens of the world? Or are our schools about getting good grades so you can prove to someone who already presumes their power that you're good enough to work for them? When I consider that question, what's missing from that calculus for me are guardians of the community. Guardians like my grandfather, William Bell. Guardians like my mother, the good Dr. Gail Bell Baptiste. Guardians like Mr. Michael Hooper and James Rocky Robinson. Guardians who knew that power is not the exclusive property of those that have money. We all have power. We all have power. And power is for the pursuit of what you need the world to be. Real guardians are guardians that use ingenuity to protect and preserve the inherent power that youth have to shape their own world. That's the mindset that I'm working for my children to have. That's the mindset I'm working for my children's friends to have. That's the mindset I'm working for the community to have. Because when everybody has that kind of mindset, everybody makes a place for themselves in the world. No one has to go around begging those who they perceive as having more power than them for their place in it. I'm working for all of us to stand up. I'm working for all of us not to be intimidated or bullied ever again. This is the legacy that my grandfather left for me. And I pass it to you for all of us to use from tonight forward. Ashe. Thank you. Thank you. My mother. Thank you. Thank you, Mom. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.